Hi everyone, here's the Book Chemist once again, and today I will be talking about The Recognitions by William Gaddis. But this is not going to be a review as usual, mostly because I didn't finish The Recognitions. I got to the halfway mark, I read halfway through the novel, and then I realized that I just had to give it up, that it didn't make sense for me to continue reading, for a variety of reasons that I'll be talking about, and my hope is that this video beyond The Recognitions, which by the way is one of the books you've been asking me about the most since I started the channel, so I understand that there's an interest in talking about the novel. Hopefully this video will touch upon that. But beyond The Recognitions, I thought this might be a chance to talk about difficult books, about books that we can't really relate to and that we just eventually decide to give up on. I'm sure many of us have found books that they couldn't really connect with and they just decided to set aside. Why is that? I've been talking about my experience with The Recognitions on my Patreon page with my patrons, the people supporting the YouTube channel, and one thing I mentioned there is that had I read this book 10 years ago, I probably would have enjoyed it more, or at least I would have stuck with it all the way to the end. This book, by the way, has been sitting on my shelf, and I only really got round to reading it now because I've been going, in the last year or more, I've been going through a phase where I stopped buying new books and I've just been reading the books that had been sitting on my shelf. The reason why I think I would have stuck with the book 10 years ago is that at the time I was a literature undergraduate and I had an appetite, as many people, many passionate readers get when they get to college and they're given all these difficult and challenging books to study. I had an appetite for difficult books. It was one of the topics I talked about the most when I started the YouTube channel in 2012. And I think the reasons behind it were many, but I think in general it's very common for obnoxious young men to read a lot of difficult books to seek some kind of confirmation that they are actually devoted readers and that they see something especially meaningful in all of these cryptic and incomprehensible novels, and that somehow this sets them apart. It's hipsterism 101. You seek difficult things for the validation that they give you and to gain some kind of social or even just cult. Even beyond this, 10 years ago I still had very romantic, extreme views about works of art as these salvific treasures that redeemed life from its difficulties and its failures. And The Recognitions is steeped in this romantic and modernist view of the work of art, and it would have definitely resonated with me much more back then. But the reasons why I read the way I read and my views on these things changed massively in the course of the last decade, and very often the perspective that you find represented throughout the entire text, I found it mostly really annoying. But when I started reading The Recognitions, I was actually quite excited and somewhat reassured. I had already decided that if the first 50-100 pages didn't convince me, I would probably set the book aside. I didn't see much point sticking with it, except that the first 100 pages were quite enthralling. They are somewhat difficult, the prose is very dense, you don't get that much of an insight into the emotional life of these characters, but you still get a brilliant picture of a small conservative family, a pastor and this ultra-conservative aunt, and the young protagonist as a child being torn between their influences and seeing the world through his unique, very sensitive perspective. It's all very fascinating, and there's a constant and beautiful criticism of religiosity, especially in this sort of conservative communities. That was quite... To put it differently, The Recognitions is an immensely gaudy novel. Religion is such a central concern to it, but at least in this first section, it didn't necessarily feel like the novel was just trying to be moralizing about religion, or at the opposite end, well, it was just trying to poke fun at religion in the kind of way that gets old very fast. Instead, it seemed like it was presenting an interesting approach that was quite tongue-in-cheek in its humor, in the way it criticized the bigot and an hypocritical religiosity of this conservative community, while at the same time showing, for instance, the pagan roots of the religions that Protestantism that these people were embracing. It was all really interesting and really quite clever. I mean, not to spoil anything, but an animal gets crucified in this first section of the novel. That's quite fun. It's quite interesting to read about. It reads like the bleakest, maybe most difficult prose by Faulkner, but it is equally compelling even when it's most. Add on top of this that William Gaddis has great talents as a writer, and conventional talents too. A lot of passages in here are quite effortlessly funny and quotable and very finely chiseled and really just quite nice prose. There's this passage that I like a lot where he describes a frozen pavement, and he says, "Then it froze, and every corner presented opportunity for entertainment. The vastly amusing spectacle of well-dressed people suspended in the indecorous positions which precede skull fractures," which makes what follows and the main core of the novel even more inexcusable. I don't know much about the writing process behind the recognitions. All I know is that I think it took the author 7 years. It took the authors a long time to write the novel. What I could perceive, and I would stake my money on, is that the first passage, these first 100 pages describing the protagonist Wyatt's childhood, were written at an earlier time, and the novel back then was going somewhere different, because after that passage, once we move a few years into the future, once Wyatt's married, the tone changes completely. It becomes difficult to follow quite what is happening. Most of the novel becomes concerned with the petty lives of these artsy hipster types living in New York. For some reason, Wyatt's name is not mentioned again. Why would you even do that, William? What function does that serve other than to confuse who the hell is speaking and what's happening? It's not like we don't figure it out within a couple of paragraphs. You're just being difficult for its own sake. People criticize Cormac McCarthy's dialogue. Cormac McCarthy is immensely clear compared to the dialogue in the recognitions, which again feels difficult for its own sake, has that vibe that you find a lot in some postmodernist fiction of the most cryptic variety, that the author is just telling you to fuck off for no real and significant reason. And I believe that's exactly the point. Speaking of postmodernism, the recognitions reminded me a lot of Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon, another novel that combines a few really compelling passages and chapters and a rather interesting plot with other sections that are completely incomprehensible and nonsensical. Except that when Gravity's Rainbow disintegrates and departs from sense, it does it in a rather druggy way. It feels like the novel is on some kind of acid trip, which makes sense to me. I feel like Thomas Pynchon definitely partook of some recreational herbs and stems back in the day. Whereas when the recognition disintegrates and takes off, it feels more like some kind of religious experience. It puts me in mind of either demonic possession or a priest standing in front of some altar giving a very long rambling sermon to its audience. That's because the recognitions to me feels propelled and fueled by an immense, monstrous hate of modernity. There are a lot of passages in here criticizing, for instance, advertisement and the way American society in the 50s was moving more and more toward an extreme consumeristic society. And hey, there is so much to be appreciated there. It's true, we don't need all of that crap that the advertisement industry is selling us. I'll be the first to admit that. But I feel like the novel takes it one step beyond like social criticism and takes it into full contempt mundi. It feels, at times, it feels like reading some kind of medieval essay on the insignificance of existence, vanitas vanitatem, and all that stuff and all. You want to read the recognitions? Just go to any conservative Italian town on a Sunday morning and go to Mass. The priest will similarly be talking about the evils and the ills or the ailments of modernity, except that the priest will be talking about, I don't know, LGBT culture and the fact that they are teaching respect for other cultures and other genders in schools, whereas in the recognitions, Gaddis rails against the advertisement industry, even though Gaddis is quite homophobic and even more is very transphobic in his own novel and uses his transgender characters as just another symptom of the disease that he finds in. The only point I will consider is that for all that Gaddis' trans characters are sickening to read, all of his characters kind of are. The entire novel is motivated again by a great contempt of human beings. All of his characters are petty and silly and concerned with their own success and don't really listen to other people. And there isn't a drop of sympathy or empathy in this novel at all. And I'm not here saying that, novels should be about nice people. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying. Everybody is an asshole, and I think we can all agree on that. But if you don't have that kind of fascination with humans, why are you even writing novels about, which by definition are as deep as you can get into human consciousness? Obviously, a novel that's motivated by that kind of tension will be unreadable. Obviously, I genuinely believe that Gaddis didn't really give a shit if his readers understood him. I don't think he liked them. Are there positive characters in the novel? Of course. These young genius men, painters and composers who are so unable to cope with all the difficulties of modernity and instead chase their pure dreams of complete aesthetic bliss and are seen as these almost saintly figures in this sick world, which is obviously a teenage dream. It's a sort of masturbatory fantasy of the artist as this, such a pure spirit, what a pity that the rest of the world is dragging him down. And I will also mention that both of these young men are Stanley and Wyatt are persecuted by these predatorial women, and the novel is immensely misogynistic. It felt very misogynistic to me. Every woman in here is either petty and stupid, or at the opposite end of the spectrum, there's some kind of Saint Teresa and there's some kind of Virgin Mary figure. Recognitions is high modernism running amok with its flaunting of classical sources and scholarly erudition, especially on theology and on classical texts. It's very much a modernist text, as much as it is with its disgust with modernity and the modern world and these romantic ideas about art as salvific, but it is also a beat novel, I would argue. This misogyny that I was talking about reminded me a lot of Howl by Allen Ginsberg, which is obviously a fundamental poem in the evolution of American poetry, but there are also quite a few lines in there where Ginsberg talks about women as these entrapping forces that force genius men to just settle down and buy a house and become modernized and commodified. And that's an immensely patronizing, misguided and flat out wrong view on the state of society at the time or in any other historical period. In his introduction, William Gass commented on the fact that the reason why all of these characters are so obnoxious and awful people is because the novel is exposing the workings of social interactions and the way, for instance, in which in our conversations with others, we're never really listening to others, but we're only ever concerned with our own petty problems, and we all behave awfully to one another. And this is what makes the novel difficult to digest, but also so relevant. it's bullshit to me. What novel doesn't do that? What novel doesn't expose and explore the dynamics of human interactions? Any Dickens or Bronte sisters or Zadie Smith does that. Any novel does that. Some novels do it better than others, but it's the baseline requirement of fiction. If you have two characters, that kind of happens. More broadly speaking, the introduction by William Gaddis does the classic hipster judo, where if you don't understand the novel or if you don't like it, it's because you're too stupid for it. I think a much better companion, if you choose to read the Recognitions, is Jonathan Franzen's essay Mr. Difficult, a very famous essay where he talks about his experience with Gaddis and, more broadly speaking, about reading difficult novels. And Franzen said that he read the Recognitions, it's possibly the most difficult novel he read, when he was a young man. But the way he did it is that he sat down with the book for like 8 hours a day and just read it as if it were work, which is the most WASP thing ever. He admits it himself in the essay. I'll put a link to it in the description box. This idea that he had to take it as work. You know, he couldn't just sit down with a novel and waste his days away. If he was going to read so much, it had to be work. And that points at the paradox of the Recognitions, that for all that it's criticizing this obtuse, old-fashioned religiosity, it's the most Puritan book I've ever read. It's all work and no fun. And if you can't accept this, and if you go looking for the kind of entertainment and human connection that we expect in books, that's because you are either, a silly reader and as a consequence a sinner of sorts. You've probably seen what's happening now. I was getting really irritated with the book and really annoyed with it, even angry, and I've tried not to. I'm sorry if I've sounded obnoxious myself in talking about the Recognitions, because I'm sure there's much to be appreciated in here, and I'm sure there's many fans of the book out there, and obviously I'm not criticizing the fans. But I was just losing my patience with it, and in fact I've been waving it around in front of the camera, but I decided to abandon it at the halfway mark, and I'll be selling it, and that was that for me and the Recognitions. What I'm curious to hear about is whether you found similar connections and similar impressions in your own reading of other difficult books, or even beyond difficulty of books that you just couldn't get into. Did you have similar experiences? Did you find yourself getting mad at these books? Did you decide to drop them? Did you stick with them? I'm curious to discuss this in the comments, as always. And thank you so much for watching the video, and thank you so much to my patrons for supporting the YouTube channel. Their names should be flashing on the screen, and they're all awesome people. And I will see you in the next video. Bye everyone.